The first time my ex casually referred to my childcare money as family support, I did not react to it because at the time the sentence sounded harmless enough to pass by without setting off any alarms in my head. Looking back now, I think that was part of the reason the situation escalated as far as it eventually did. Problems inside families rarely begin with somebody openly demanding control over your money or your life. Usually the shift happens slowly through comments and assumptions that sound reasonable enough in the moment that nobody questions them properly until things already feel emotionally complicated. At the beginning, everything still looked normal. My ex and I had been separated for a little over 3 years by that point, and while the relationship itself ended badly, we eventually reached a version of co-parenting that at least functioned on the surface. We were not friends exactly, but we could survive school meetings without arguing, exchange schedules without turning every conversation into a fight, and get through birthdays or holidays without making everybody else uncomfortable. Honestly, after the divorce, functional already felt better than I expected things would ever become. Our daughter was 7 when the custody agreement was finalized, and because my work schedule stayed unpredictable for several years afterward, we ended up relying on a combination of after-school programs, state childcare reimbursement, and occasional help from both sides of the family whenever schedules became impossible to manage alone. The childcare money itself was not some giant jackpot the way people online sometimes imagine when they hear words like reimbursement or assistance. Most of it disappeared almost immediately into after-school care, activity fees, transportation, emergency babysitters, school expenses, and all the random costs that come with raising a child. Still, the money mattered because for the first time in years I could breathe a little without feeling like every unexpected expense was about to destroy my budget for the month. Before that, even small problems felt stressful. If my daughter needed new shoes during the same week the car needed repairs, I immediately started calculating overtime hours in my head before I even checked my account balance. So when the reimbursements finally started arriving consistently, the biggest thing they gave me was stability. For the first few months, nobody treated the situation strangely at all. My ex occasionally complained that childcare costs should technically be divided differently, but divorced parents argue about financial stuff constantly, so none of those conversations stood out to me in any serious way. The first thing that actually started bothering me was not even something my ex said directly. It started with her mother instead. One afternoon during school pickup, my ex's mother casually mentioned that it was nice the government was finally helping the whole family a little, and I remember pausing because something about the wording felt slightly off. It was not offensive exactly, but it sounded strange enough that my brain held on to it afterward. I laughed awkwardly and explained that most of the money disappeared immediately into childcare expenses anyway. But she kept talking like the reimbursements created some kind of shared relief for everybody connected to our daughter. She mentioned groceries becoming expensive, gas prices getting worse, how often they helped with pickups, and how difficult things had supposedly been for all of us during the years after the separation. None of it sounded aggressive enough to justify starting an argument because everything still sounded technically reasonable on the surface. And to be fair, my ex's family genuinely had helped sometimes. Her mother occasionally picked our daughter up from school when schedules became messy, and there were periods during the first year after the divorce where her sister watched our daughter for a few hours while both of us worked late. At first, I appreciated all of it because after divorce you spend years rebuilding routines that used to happen automatically. Every schedule change creates another complication. Sick days become negotiations, and one work emergency somehow creates 3 more problems waiting behind it. The problem was that somewhere along the way, gratitude slowly started turning into emotional accounting without me realizing it. A few weeks later, my ex brought up the childcare money again while we were standing outside my daughter's gymnastics class waiting for pickup. The conversation started normally enough. We were talking about uniforms, activity fees, and whether our daughter wanted to continue classes during summer break. And then almost casually my ex mentioned that maybe some of the reimbursement money should help balance things out a little, since her family spent so much time helping with transportation and childcare support. At first I assumed she meant specific expenses directly connected to our daughter, which honestly would not have bothered me much because at least that conversation made practical sense. But then she started mentioning unrelated things like her mother's car repairs, groceries, gas, and how stressful things have been for everybody. That was the first moment I remember feeling genuinely uncomfortable because suddenly the childcare money was no longer being discussed like support meant specifically for our daughter's care. It was starting to sound more like a shared resource connected to everybody surrounding her. I remember asking carefully what exactly she meant, and my ex immediately shifted her tone slightly, like she realized I was reacting more seriously than she expected. She said she was not asking for money, and only thought that people who help should probably feel supported too sometimes. Then she laughed quietly and added, "You know what I mean." Honestly, I did not fully understand what she meant yet, but the conversation stayed in my head afterward anyway. After that conversation, I started noticing how often the childcare reimbursements came up around her family in small, uncomfortable ways. If somebody mentioned bills during dinner, her mother joked that, "At least the childcare money exists now." If school expenses came up, her sister casually mentioned how much time everybody spent helping after the divorce. Nothing individually sounded serious enough to justify confrontation, but together the comments slowly created this strange feeling that the money was becoming psychologically communal in their minds. The first time I realized my daughter was starting to notice the tension too happened during a small argument that honestly should have stayed insignificant. I was dropping her off at my ex's apartment one Friday evening when my daughter asked whether she could join a school trip that cost more than I expected. I told her I needed to check the dates and budget first before promising anything. And before I could finish answering, my ex casually jumped into the conversation and said, "Your dad has childcare money now, sweetheart. We'll figure it out." The sentence itself was not openly hostile, but something about the word "we" bothered me immediately, because lately every financial conversation surrounding our daughter had started sounding less like coordination and more like collective ownership. My daughter did not notice anything strange. She smiled, grabbed her backpack, and ran inside excited about the possibility of the trip while I stood there near the parking lot realizing how uncomfortable those conversations had quietly started making me. Then my ex looked at me, shrugged casually, and said something that stayed in my head the entire drive home. She said, "That money helps all of us if you really think about it." After that conversation outside the apartment, I started noticing things I probably would have ignored automatically a few months earlier, and that was what made the entire situation feel so uncomfortable because nothing openly dramatic had actually happened yet. Nobody demanded money from me directly, nobody sent angry messages, and nobody acted entitled in a way that would have justified some massive confrontation. Instead, the atmosphere around the childcare reimbursements slowly started changing until completely ordinary conversations began leaving this strange pressure sitting in the back of my head afterward. And once I noticed it clearly, I started hearing it everywhere. About a week later, my daughter stayed with my ex most of the weekend because I picked up overtime shifts at work, and when I arrived Sunday evening to bring her home, her mother was unloading grocery bags from the trunk of her car while talking about how expensive everything had become lately. Normally, I would not have thought twice about a conversation like that because everybody complains about grocery prices now. But then she laughed and said, "At least the childcare reimbursements finally help everybody breathe a little." And for some reason that word, everybody, stayed with me immediately. I remember standing there beside the car trying to decide whether I was overthinking the situation because technically nobody had actually asked me for anything yet. Nobody openly said, "Give us money," but at the same time the reimbursements kept getting discussed like they existed inside some kind of shared emotional system connected to their family instead of being specifically tied to childcare expenses. I laughed awkwardly again and explained that most of the reimbursements already disappeared into school costs, activity fees, after-school programs, transportation, and all the random expenses that come with raising a child. But her mother nodded and then added something that bothered me the entire drive home afterward. She said, "Well, your daughter wouldn't have made it through those years without all of us helping too." And the frustrating part was that the sentence itself was true, which was exactly what made everything emotionally complicated. The first years after the divorce were rough financially. There were periods where schedules became impossible and both sides of the family stepped in occasionally because there honestly was no other choice. My ex's mother picked my daughter up from school plenty of times, her sister watched her during emergencies, and even my ex herself covered extra weekends whenever my work schedule became chaotic unexpectedly. Because of that, every time these conversations happened, part of me immediately started defending their behavior before I even finished processing why the comments bothered me in the first place. That is how guilt works inside families, because people rarely demand things directly at first. Usually they remind you of sacrifices often enough that eventually you start feeling selfish for wanting boundaries afterward. A few days later, the situation became even more uncomfortable during a conversation that honestly should have stayed completely normal. My daughter needed new clothes because she had apparently entered another growth phase where children somehow outgrow shoes every 6 weeks just to personally attack their parents financially. So my ex and I met after work at a department store to finish shopping faster together. For most of the evening, everything actually felt surprisingly relaxed. We joked about prices, argued lightly about backpacks, and spent 20 minutes watching our daughter change her mind over which shoes she suddenly absolutely needed. And for a while the evening almost felt normal again. Everything stayed relaxed until we reached the checkout counter. The cashier read the total out loud, and before I could even take my wallet out, my ex casually looked at me and said, "You should probably cover most of it since the childcare money just came in." And the sentence immediately made me pause. Not because I had any issue spending money on my daughter, but because lately every expense connected to her somehow circled back to those reimbursements specifically. I paid without arguing because I did not want tension in front of our daughter, but afterward while we walked through the parking lot carrying shopping bags toward our cars, I finally asked why the childcare money kept getting mentioned every single time finances came up lately. At first my ex looked genuinely surprised by the question, but almost immediately she became defensive and told me nobody was obsessed with the money. According to her, I was acting strange over people simply acknowledging reality, and she said the reimbursements made things easier for everybody involved in helping with childcare, so obviously people thought about them sometimes. I remember asking carefully why her family kept talking about the money like it belonged to the entire support system around our daughter, instead of being specifically connected to childcare expenses, and my ex sighed after I said that like she thought I was intentionally refusing to understand something obvious. Then she said something that genuinely shifted how I saw the entire situation, because she told me the childcare support only existed because people around us sacrificed time and energy helping raise our daughter after the divorce. After she said that, the conversation stopped sounding financial to me. It started feeling more like the money had become symbolic proof that everybody deserved compensation for surviving those difficult years together. I told her I appreciated every person who helped us after the separation, but helping occasionally did not create shared ownership over money specifically intended for childcare support. And the second I used the phrase shared ownership, my ex's expression changed in a way that immediately made the conversation heavier. She suddenly looked genuinely offended, almost like she thought I was accusing her of being manipulative when she believed the conversation was completely reasonable. She told me nobody was trying to take anything from me and that I was twisting supportive conversations into some kind of attack because I had become too defensive about money lately. And honestly, that frustrated me even more because I started noticing another pattern forming around these conversations. Every time I questioned the situation, the discussion somehow shifted away from the actual issue and toward my attitude instead. So suddenly I was too defensive, too sensitive about money, and apparently looking for problems where nobody else saw any, while everybody else somehow got to discuss the childcare reimbursements emotionally without it sounding inappropriate. Even after the conversation ended, the discomfort followed me the entire drive home. By that point, the thing bothering me most was no longer even the possibility that somebody wanted money from me. What actually bothered me was the growing realization that people had quietly started counting those childcare reimbursements as part of their family reality long before anybody discussed it openly with me. After that shopping trip, the entire situation started feeling less like awkward financial tension and more like something quietly becoming normalized around me without my permission. That was probably the hardest part to explain even to myself because technically nobody had directly demanded money from me yet. But at the same time, conversations around the childcare reimbursements had slowly started carrying this underlying assumption that the money existed for more than just our daughter's care. And once I noticed that assumption clearly, I started seeing it almost everywhere. About 2 weeks later, my ex invited me to her mother's birthday dinner because our daughter wanted both of us there. Normally, I would have skipped something like that if I had the choice because post-divorce family gatherings always feel slightly artificial no matter how polite everybody acts. But my daughter had spent the entire week talking about it excitedly, so I agreed. At first, the evening honestly felt normal enough. Her mother rented a small back room at a local restaurant. People talked about work, school, and random family gossip. And for most of the night, everything stayed comfortably inside ordinary small talk. My daughter spent half the evening running between tables showing people drawings she made at school, and for a while I actually started wondering whether I had begun overanalyzing the entire money situation because nothing strange had happened all night. Then one of my ex's cousins casually asked whether childcare reimbursements were actually worth all the paperwork. And the second the question landed on the table, I noticed multiple people suddenly paying attention to the conversation in a way that immediately made me uncomfortable. I answered honestly and explained that the money helped, but most of it disappeared directly into childcare expenses anyway. Before I could say anything else, though, my ex's mother laughed and said, "Well, at least all the years of helping are finally paying off a little," and several people around the table laughed lightly after she said it, just casually enough that nobody else seemed to think the sentence sounded strange. Because suddenly the childcare reimbursements were being discussed publicly like some kind of delayed compensation system for everybody who helped after the divorce. I tried steering the conversation away from the subject by joking that nobody gets rich raising children. But instead of letting the topic die naturally, my ex's sister immediately jumped in and started listing all the ways their side of the family had carried things over the years. She talked about school pickups, babysitting, weekend coverage, emergency schedule changes, and all the last-minute situations where they stepped in to help while both of us were struggling after the separation. And once again, none of what she said was technically false. That was what made the entire situation so uncomfortable, because every conversation mixed genuine past support together with this growing implication that support had somehow created permanent emotional credit afterward. Then my ex shrugged casually and said, "Honestly, the childcare money helps stabilize everybody a little now." And the second she said it, I remember looking around the table realizing nobody reacted strangely to the sentence at all. Nobody looked confused, nobody corrected her, and if anything a couple people nodded slightly like the statement made complete sense. Sitting there listening to everybody talk so casually about the money was the moment I realized how normal this had already become for them. The childcare money was no longer being viewed as reimbursement connected specifically to our daughter's expenses. In their minds, it had slowly turned into family relief tied to all the years of shared sacrifice after the divorce. The rest of dinner felt different after that realization settled into my head. I still smiled when my daughter talked to me and answered questions normally, but mentally I spent the next hour replaying old conversations in my head and suddenly realizing how many small comments I ignored over the previous months because individually they never sounded serious enough to challenge directly. By the time dinner ended, I already knew the situation had gone much further emotionally than I originally thought. The thing that finally pushed me into confronting it directly happened about a week later. I came to pick my daughter up after work one evening, and while she was upstairs getting her backpack ready, I overheard my ex and her mother talking quietly in the kitchen. At first, I was not even trying to listen intentionally, but then I heard my name followed immediately by the words, "Next reimbursement deposit." And after that, it became impossible not to pay attention. Her mother asked whether there would finally be enough room now to help with some overdue bills, and my ex answered in this casual, frustrated tone, like somebody discussing household budgeting with a partner instead of talking about money connected to our daughter's childcare support. She said she was trying to work on it slowly because I had become sensitive about the money lately. I still remember standing there near the hallway feeling this strange mix of anger and disbelief because suddenly every uncomfortable feeling I had been struggling to explain to myself over the previous months snapped into focus all at once. What bothered me most was realizing they were no longer talking about the money hypothetically. In their minds, future plans had already started forming around it. My ex finally noticed me standing near the hallway and immediately stopped talking mid-sentence. And honestly, the silence afterward told me more than the actual conversation probably would have. Then she smiled too quickly and asked whether I needed help grabbing my daughter's things upstairs like the previous 30 seconds had never happened. I asked calmly what exactly she meant by working on it slowly, and the second I said it, both her and her mother immediately became defensive in that way people do when a private conversation accidentally escapes into public. Her mother insisted I was misunderstanding things, and my ex quickly added that they were just talking, but then she said something that stayed in my head the entire drive home afterward. She told me nobody was trying to take advantage of me, and that after everything everybody had done over the years, there should probably be more balance. And honestly, that word balance bothered me almost more than the money itself, because balance only exists when people already believe they are entitled to a share of something. After overhearing that conversation in the kitchen, I stopped being able to treat the situation like harmless awkwardness or poor wording, because for the first time I finally understood these discussions were no longer hypothetical. My ex and her family were not casually venting about money anymore. Somewhere along the way, they had already started building expectations around those childcare reimbursements emotionally, and the more I thought about it afterward, the more obvious it became that I was probably one of the last people to realize how far things had drifted. By that point, what bothered me most was realizing the situation no longer even felt like greed. It felt like years of sacrifice had slowly turned into entitlement without anybody noticing when the shift happened. For the first time, somebody was finally saying the quiet part out loud instead of hiding it behind vague conversations about support and sacrifice. In their minds, they had already emotionally earned part of that money because they connected it to years of helping after the divorce, and because the reasoning sounded emotionally grounded on the surface. Every conversation became difficult to challenge without sounding cold or ungrateful. A few days later, my ex called me while I was leaving work and asked whether we could talk about something practical regarding expenses around our daughter. Even before she explained what she meant, I already felt my stomach tighten, because by that point every financial conversation somehow circled back to the reimbursements eventually. At first she sounded careful, almost rehearsed. She explained that her mother was struggling with overdue utility bills after some unexpected car repairs, and then casually added that maybe this would be a good time for everybody to help each other a little more evenly. That wording immediately irritated me because she was still framing the situation like we were discussing collective family resources instead of childcare money connected specifically to our daughter's needs. I asked directly what exactly she was suggesting, and after hesitating for a second, she finally admitted that maybe I could temporarily help her mother financially until things stabilized. The second she said it out loud, something inside me shifted completely, because for months the conversation stayed hidden underneath implications, emotional guilt, and vague language about sacrifice, support, and family balance. I told her the childcare reimbursements were already allocated toward our daughter's expenses and that I was not comfortable using them to cover unrelated household bills for other adults. The silence after I said that lasted several seconds longer than it should have. Then my ex sighed heavily and said something that honestly bothered me more than the request itself. She said, "You make everything sound so cold when you talk about money." That sentence stayed with me because suddenly I realized the real conflict was no longer about finances anymore. By that point, the argument no longer even felt financial anymore, because we were clearly talking about two completely different ideas of what family obligation was supposed to mean. In her mind, generosity proved love, and boundaries automatically sounded selfish. I explained again that I had no issue helping directly when emergencies involved our daughter, but there was a difference between childcare support and becoming financially responsible for her extended family's problems. The second I said extended family, her tone changed immediately. She told me I was acting like her family were strangers even though they spent years helping raise our daughter after the divorce. At that point, I finally asked whether her family genuinely believed those childcare reimbursements belonged partly to them emotionally because of everything that happened after the separation. My ex got quiet for a few seconds after that question, and when she answered, her voice sounded less defensive and more genuinely confused, almost like she could not understand why I was struggling so hard with something that felt obvious to her. Then she said something that honestly explained the entire situation better than anything else had up to that point. She told me people naturally expect support back after carrying someone for years. That wording sat in my head immediately because suddenly I understood the emotional math happening underneath all these conversations. In their minds, The childcare reimbursements had slowly turned into proof that all the difficult years after the divorce deserved some kind of emotional payback. I remember leaning back inside my car after hearing that and realizing we were no longer discussing practical expenses at all. We were arguing about emotional ownership over survival years that everybody experienced differently. My ex continued talking after that, and the more she explained things, the worse the situation started sounding. Apparently, her mother had already been postponing certain bills because she assumed things would become easier now. Her sister expected more help with gas because of all the driving she had done over the years, and at one point my ex casually mentioned that her family assumed I would eventually contribute more evenly once the reimbursements became stable. That word, assumed, hit me hard because nobody discussed expectations with me directly. They just quietly built future plans around money they emotionally decided belonged partly to them. I finally interrupted her and asked whether she realized how inappropriate all of this sounded from my side, and instead of answering directly, she became emotional almost immediately. She started talking about exhaustion, sacrifice, and how difficult those years were for everybody involved. And honestly, part of me understood why she felt justified, because those years were genuinely hard on everyone around us. But understanding somebody's emotions and agreeing with their entitlement are not the same thing. That was the distinction nobody else seemed willing to acknowledge anymore. The conversation ended badly after that because eventually I told her something she clearly did not expect to hear. I said the childcare reimbursements were no longer going to be discussed with her family at all moving forward. After I said that, neither of us spoke for a few seconds. Then she asked very quietly, "So now you're shutting everybody out after everything they did for you?" And honestly, that was the moment I realized we had finally crossed into dangerous territory emotionally, because somewhere along the way, support had stopped being viewed as kindness in their minds. Somewhere along the way, support had stopped feeling unconditional and started feeling transactional instead. After that phone call, things between me and my ex changed in a way that probably would not have looked dramatic to anybody outside the situation, but the tension underneath everything became impossible to ignore once it was finally out in the open. The biggest difference was that I stopped trusting the emotional framing around those conversations completely. Before, every uncomfortable comment about money still carried enough ambiguity that part of me kept trying to give everybody the benefit of the doubt. I kept telling myself maybe people were just stressed financially. Maybe conversations were coming out wrong, or maybe I was becoming too sensitive because divorce already makes every parenting discussion feel emotionally loaded. But after hearing phrases like more balance, carrying someone, and everybody deserves support back, I could no longer pretend the situation was only awkward communication anymore. And honestly, once I accepted that, I also started noticing how deeply it had already affected the atmosphere around my daughter. A few days later, my ex's mother casually asked my daughter whether she was excited now that things were easier financially for everybody. And hearing that sentence come out around my child irritated me more than almost anything else that happened up to that point, because my daughter immediately looked confused and asked what she meant. Her grandmother laughed it off quickly and changed the subject, but I remember sitting there realizing that even my daughter had slowly started getting pulled into adult financial resentment without fully understanding it. After hearing that conversation happen around my daughter, I stopped worrying so much about protecting everybody else's feelings. Because once children start absorbing emotional pressure connected to money, family support, and sacrifice, the atmosphere around them changes in ways adults usually underestimate badly. That same week, I moved the childcare reimbursements into a completely separate account used strictly for childcare-related expenses, school costs, medical appointments, transportation, after-school programs, and activities connected directly to my daughter. I also stopped discussing reimbursement schedules, deposit timing, or financial details with anybody outside official co-parenting conversations. At first, I honestly thought those boundaries would calm things down naturally. Instead, they made the situation worse almost immediately. My ex noticed the distance within days, and suddenly every interaction between us carried this passive tension underneath it. She started making comments about how cold I had become lately and how everything now felt strictly transactional whenever finances came up. The frustrating part was that almost everything they said still sounded reasonable on the surface unless you looked at the pattern underneath it. One evening during pickup, My ex finally confronted me directly about the account changes after realizing I had stopped discussing reimbursement timing around her family completely. She asked why I suddenly felt the need to separate everything so formally, and I answered honestly by telling her the conversations around the childcare money had become unhealthy and emotionally inappropriate. The second I said that, her entire expression changed. She looked genuinely hurt, and honestly that almost made the situation harder because I truly do not think she viewed herself as manipulative. In her mind, family support naturally created shared responsibility afterward, and because everybody had struggled together during those years, she honestly believed the money should emotionally benefit the broader support system around our daughter too. That was what made the situation feel so realistic and so dangerous at the same time. The hardest part was that none of them genuinely believed they were doing anything wrong. My ex asked whether I seriously believed her family had bad intentions, and I told her intentions were no longer the issue anymore, because somewhere along the way everybody stopped recognizing the difference between helping a child and becoming entitled to resources connected to that child afterward. That sentence ended the conversation almost immediately because she clearly realized I was no longer emotionally flexible about the subject anymore. Over the following weeks, things became awkward across the entire family. Her mother stopped making financial comments around me completely, but the emotional distance afterward became obvious. Her sister barely spoke during exchanges anymore, and every family gathering suddenly carried this quiet tension underneath it, like everybody was waiting for another argument to happen eventually. Some relatives clearly thought I had overreacted, while others avoided taking sides completely because nobody wanted to get dragged into another family argument about money. A few people actually agreed with me privately, although none of them wanted to say it publicly because family dynamics become complicated very quickly once money, sacrifice, and children all get emotionally tied together. The strangest part was that even after all the arguments, my ex still genuinely seemed confused about why the situation affected me so strongly. A few months later, during one of the calmer conversations we had after things settled down slightly, she admitted something that honestly explained the entire situation better than every argument before it combined. She said that during the hardest years after the divorce, her family started viewing my daughter almost like a shared responsibility, and over time that mindset slowly spread into everything else connected to raising her. Eventually, that mindset spread into conversations about money too. For the first time, somebody finally described the situation honestly instead of hiding it behind vague conversations about support and sacrifice. Looking back now, I think years of stress, babysitting, schedule chaos, emotional support, and financial pressure slowly erased boundaries that should have stayed clear from the beginning. And once people emotionally convinced themselves they helped carry a child together, some of them eventually start believing they deserve partial ownership over the resources connected to that child too. Even if they never say it directly at first, things eventually became calmer after enough time passed and enough boundaries stayed consistent. Family gatherings became possible again, financial conversations stopped entirely, and my daughter thankfully stayed mostly unaware of how ugly the emotional side of the situation almost became. The relationships never fully returned to what they used to be, though. After that, there was more distance between everybody, more caution during conversations, and a level of boundary awareness that honestly should have existed from the beginning. And honestly, looking back now, I think the hardest lesson in all of it was realizing that entitlement inside families rarely starts with greed alone. Most of the time, it starts with people helping for so long that eventually they stop seeing where support ends and ownership begins.